snow like one other time, but like it did not snow this much. And Leo did go, he went outside for a little bit, very good. We might go back out a little bit later, but I feel like I just need to document this. So, welcome back to me talking about books. I'm deciding to read Wuthering Heights. I really have been wanting to give it a second chance. So this is a Wuthering Heights redemption arc, maybe. Things that I thought of Wuthering Heights in high school that I think kind of messed up my reading experience is one, I went into it thinking it's a romance, and it's really not. It's just people being obsessed with each other and calling it love. Also, everyone is a horrible person, and I've accepted that there are no good characters in this, as in, like, there are no ethical characters in this. Going into it with that mindset is probably going to help me appreciate the other aspects of the book that I think I would enjoy. Like, one of the things is that it is a gothic novel, or at least it uses a lot of gothic motifs. You know, it has spooky, eerie vibes, which I like. I remember in high school I also described it as like a Victorian soap opera, which sounds fun, but if you don't really have anyone that you're rooting for, it's not as much fun. With Wuthering Heights, it is a frame story. So we start out with Heathcliff's new tenant named Mr. Lockwood, and he's kind of just there figuring out the vibes of the estate, meeting Heathcliff, and like, this is a very low point for Heathcliff. He's very weird. He seems like a man that's been haunted and has a lot of like rough edges and just has like dogs loose in his yard. So like, those are the vibes of Heathcliff. It's not a good look for him. And this is where we kind of meet his character, and we see everything through pretty much Lockwood's perspective, but then he meets one of the old servants from the estate who is like, well, let me tell you how all this went down. And so she's giving the backstory of Heathcliff and Catherine's love, so to speak, and also like how Heathcliff came to the estate and like why he is in the state in which he is in. Kind of seeing this like not through the eyes of our main characters, we're seeing this through people looking in, which is a cool concept. I like that idea. No, I'm 50 pages in. I'm now in the story within the story part. That's just kind of where I'm at. For context, it is Saturday afternoon, early Saturday afternoon, so I'm gonna try to go throughout my day, do some filming over this weekend. I always kind of taper off with filming during the weekdays just because it's the weekdays and life gets hard, but you know, we'll see what happens. Okay, so it's Sunday evening, and I just want to give an update on Wuthering Heights. If I sound annoyed, it's because I've filmed this at least like 7 different times trying to figure it out. So, we have the Earnshaws at Wuthering Heights, and then we have the Lintons at, I'm just going to call it the Grange because I can never figure out how to pronounce the name correctly. So, the Earnshaws is where Heathcliff is, and he is adopted by Father Earnshaw, and the other people with the Earnshaws is also Catherine and Hindley. And there was a mom at some point. She may have died before Heathcliff got there. I honestly could not tell you. I have no memory. So Hindley and Heathcliff bully each other a bunch. Hindley does not like Heathcliff because Heathcliff is favored by his dad and Hindley just wants some attention. Eventually, Hindley does leave because he is older, and Catherine and Heathcliff have like very much a childhood best friend kind of chemistry. But everything changes with that when they go to spy on their neighbors at the Grange, and Catherine gets hurt, and then she winds up having to stay there for like 5 weeks or something. And during that time, they civilize her. So they teach her how to be a lady and all of that. She's like conscious of society and her standing and whatnot. So that puts a damper on her and Heathcliff's relationship. And part of the reason why it makes it worse is because Hindley does come back after the dad dies to take over the estate. And because he hates Heathcliff, he makes Heathcliff more of a servant and less of like an adopted son. So he gets lower in status, and like Catherine just kind of brushes him off. So flash forward a little bit, and Edgar proposes to Catherine, and Catherine says yes. But she runs to Nellie, tells her, I decided to marry Edward, but I actually love Heathcliff, but I can't marry Heathcliff because he's poor. And so then Heathcliff overhears some of this. He doesn't hear the fact that Catherine says that she loves him. He just hears the fact that he is poor. So then he runs away in a thunderstorm, and we don't see him again. Then flash forward a few more years, and Heathcliff comes back and just like shows up at the Grange where Catherine and Edward are now like husband and wife, and decides to like stir the pot a little bit. And Edward can tell that Catherine has some feelings for Heathcliff. And on top of that, his younger sister Isabella is also catching feelings for Heathcliff. So you have like Catherine and Isabella fighting amongst each other about Heathcliff, and then Edward gets to a point where he like banishes Heathcliff from his estate and tells Catherine like it's either him or me, and then she just like goes into hysterics. And then we have Isabella, who runs away and elopes with Heathcliff. And that's like more or less where I'm at. I'm a little bit further along the plot, but like I can't do anything more than just that. So that's like the basic breakdown of what's happened. The thing with Catherine though is that she is an awful person. She's extraordinarily selfish, she's bratty, she's very classist, which is like, I mean, it's the Victorian age, like what are you gonna do? But she's a terrible person. And we are seeing this through like a second person's eyes. We're seeing it through Nellie's eyes. But based on the narration that we get, it's assumed that Catherine has always been a horrible person. Like, even as a child, Nellie hints at her severe selfishness. But the thing with Catherine is that she did grow up in a very, like, domestic violence and abusive household, which I think is, like, important context to recognize with Catherine. I don't like her at all, but, like, it does provide some kind of explanation of why she is the way that she is. Because the thing with Hindley is that he had a wife and had a son, and then his wife died during childbirth, and he went off the deep end and started drinking heavily and gambling, and because of that he started also lashing out at his family. Like, I think he definitely enacted violence towards his son. He's done so towards the servants. So it's like everyone in that house had to deal with some kind of level of violence from him. So she grew up in that, and now in her estate, she also enacts a bunch of violence. And I know that she has a lot of trauma that she's just unable to cope with, and that's definitely part of like why she's such a terrible person. But it doesn't make it excusable, but again, it adds context. So I wanted to kind of recognize that about Catherine. But the other thing with this story is that even though like the plot and the characters aren't really for me, like I do have to recognize that Emily Bronte is a fantastic writer. And there's so many things that she does in this novel that are really well done. It's very atmospheric. I appreciate that part of it. Is it better than when I read it in high school? It's kind of too early for me to say. I want to say yes a little bit since I'm going in with it with a different approach, but I do want to pull out like a couple of lines. And just so we know that I'm not annotating this one at all because I actually got it from the library, since I know that it's not one of my favorites and it probably won't be a favorite even by the end of this. But I will say that like I feel like I'm doing better with it than I did in high school. So let me just like pull a couple lines. So this is a line that Nellie tells Heathcliff when he's still a child, And it's such a beautiful foreshadowing. So she says, proud people breed sad sorrows for themselves. And the thing with Heathcliff is that he is like all about revenge, especially in the beginning part of his story, like post childhood to early adulthood. He's all about revenge, and he basically makes himself miserable because of the fact, and we can only assume that he started this whole revenge because of his pride. And like it all goes back to what Nellie said in those like couple of sentences, just a couple lines there. So I thought that was really cool. So this is from the scene where Edgar is telling Heathcliff to get out of his house. And he says, your presence is a moral poison that would contaminate the most virtuous. And I just love that comeback, basically. Like, what a fun little diss from the Victorian era, you know? I'm getting pretty close. I'm gonna try to finish it in about 2 days from now. I really want my final thoughts to actually be my final thoughts, so I'm gonna do my best to just like recap on the summary. So we left off with Isabella going to marry Heathcliff, in which she does. She finds out that he's a very abusive person, which makes a lot of sense. She does eventually wind up running away, and she winds up like living in London. She does eventually give birth to a kid and names him Linton. We also have Catherine and Edgar's marriage. Catherine does wind up being pregnant as well, but she gives birth to the kid and then she dies. And the kid's name is Kathy, which her full name is Catherine, so she's named after Catherine, but they call her Kathy. And we follow a lot of like Catherine growing up, or Kathy growing up, and it's a lot less traumatizing than what Catherine had to deal with, because I mean, Edgar is like a very present father once that he gets over his grief. She has Nellie there, and Nellie is really there to like be the moral compass for this child. And you can definitely see Nellie's biases between Catherine and Kathy, because a lot of like the traits that both of them share, Nellie like equates Catherine's actions to more being like malice, and then Kathy's actions are more like because of her naivete. So basically there is definitely bias there. But eventually Isabella does pass away, so Edgar goes to get Linton, because Edgar knows about Linton and also Heathcliff, but Heathcliff doesn't know where Isabella is. So he goes to get Linton, and Edgar's kind of like, hey, like, I'm really hoping that he can just stay with me and I can be his guardian, but like, that's not super likely. Heathcliff does get word, so he demands for Linton to come to Wuthering Heights. And the big thing with that is because Heathcliff does wind up being the owner of Wuthering Heights, so he needs an heir so that he can continue his revenge. He's actually not abusive to Linton very much at all. Linton's also a very like weak, feeble kind of person. He has a fragile health, so I'm sure if he like got punched by Heathcliff or something, like the kid would be gone. Heathcliff is pretty aware of that, so he tries to like kind of dote on Linton a little bit. But basically like the two kids wind up growing up completely separated from each other and like don't realize that the other one is only like a couple miles away. But then Kathy does eventually stumble upon Wuthering Heights. The first time that she stumbles upon Wuthering Heights is before Linton ever comes, and she meets Harrington. And they start off like kind of being fine and normal to each other. Kathy's like 13 at this point, I think. And so, she's very sheltered. She doesn't understand much of the world. And also she's very classist because it's the 1800s. It gets revealed that like he's kind of a servant-y status at Wuthering Heights. So then Kathy starts trying to order him around like a servant, and then Harrington's like really offended by that. So then Nellie like ushers her away and is like, don't tell your father about this. You're not supposed to know about Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is an evil man, yada yada. So then, you know, things run smoothly for a little bit. And then, of course, we have Linton and everything. So Kathy winds up running into Wuthering Heights again, and that's where she's like, oh my gosh, Linton, this is where you've been all along. What? And so then they start talking, writing, like, secret letters to each other, and Nellie finds them and then reprimands Kathy and is like, you have to stop. There is no more of this. And they do wind up running into each other again at some point, and during that, we see, like, just some toxic teenage love stuff. Like, I can't even. And we have like a period where Edward winds up getting sick, and then Nellie's also sick, so Kathy's kind of like, she's free to do her own thing, and she has her evenings free when she's not attending either one of them. So then she starts secretly going to see Linton, and he loves to like guilt trip her a lot. He's like, I'm sick and dying because you made me this way. It's like, Kathy is not God. Again, like some toxic teenage love, for sure. And I'm kind of at the part where Nellie has officially caught her sneaking off and like going to see Linton and stuff. And once again was like, you have to stop. You need to stop this. Which, you know what? I support it, because Linton is kind of trash. Hold on. It's gonna be a minute. So let me just try to quickly sum up from what I remember happens from my high school days. So I'm pretty sure that she does wind up marrying Linton at some point. And so then she goes to live in Wuthering Heights. And I'm sure that her dad probably dies at some point, because that just makes sense. And I think Linton does die as well, because, like, he's sickly. You know, he wasn't going to last that long. So that's why in the beginning of this book, we have Heathcliff, Kathy, and Harrington all living in Wuthering Heights. And then the Grange is open for a tenant. So that's the plot summary. Hello. I did finish Wuthering Heights on Saturday, like I was hoping. I went ahead and turned the book back into the library, so I don't have it as like a little prop. So I feel a little bit lost, I'm not gonna lie. I really like having the thing to hold, but instead I placed some books in the background. I don't just have books on top of my couch. I did like write down some of the quotes that I really liked from this second half of my reading, and I have it on my laptop over there, so like I'm just gonna turn and read it. It's gonna be very awkward for everyone. Isabella says, treason and violence are spears pointed at both ends. They wound those who resort to them worse than their enemies. And like the visuals of that are just great. That's all I had for that. And then we have another really good visual-ish quote that's kind of deep that Heathcliff says to Harrington, by the way, after his dad dies. Harrington's dad dies. And he says, we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another with the same wind twisting it. Which I guess is kind of like the whole thesis of the second half of the book between Harrington and Catherine's eventual love story. But finishing off just like the little last part of the book, Mr. Lockwood was like, you know what? You guys are crazy. I'm going back to London. I'll see you in like 6 months. I'll still pay my share of like this year-long lease or whatever. So like he leaves and then he comes back and then everything's totally altered. Like he goes to the Heights and he's like, whoa, people seem happy. So like what happened? And Nellie's like, oh, Heathcliff died. And it's like, no, that makes sense. So then you have the backstory of like, well, first, the fact that, like, Kathy eventually does apologize to Harrington after his hunting accident because she thought he was going to die or something. That, like, yeah, I'm sorry that I keep calling you an idiot and stuff. I actually really care about you. And I was like, okay, weird messaging. But, like, I mean, at least we're apologizing for our past sins to be really dramatic about it. So I'm like, okay, something. I'll take it. So that's when they start actually, like, having more of like a love relationship and things. Like Harrington always kind of seems like he's into Kathy. I mean, maybe not when she's like, when they first meet, she's a 13-year-old girl. The age gaps in this book is like very unsettling, but he starts to kind of like, I think, be interested in her once that she starts coming more regularly to see Linton. And I'm sure there's a lot of jealousy there. So Kathy starts teaching Harrington how to read, and that's kind of like where Lockwood like walks in on them. He sees like them like learning to read together and stuff. So it's a nice moment. I'm gonna give them that. But so Heathcliff, he kind of just starts like withdrawing from the world and stops eating and sleeping, and like you can kind of infer that he's being haunted by Catherine and the memory of her, or maybe her ghost. Like, again, up to your interpretation. So then eventually he gets to the point where he just like dies because he's just been starving himself and not sleeping. And you know, you can only go so many days of that before you eventually just die in your armchair in front of the fire. The big question here is, did I like this more than when I read it in high school? Because in high school, I hated every second of it, and I was mad that I had to read it ever, and everyone in the book made me mad, and I just like struggled to read through it. So was it like this time? No. It's actually better than when I read it in high school, but I'm not gonna say that like, oh, I love this book. Like, it's okay. Like, I don't like the plot that much, mostly because it is a very character-driven book, and I hate all the characters except sometimes not Kathy. So it's like, that's a really big ask for a character-driven book. And you know, not characters aren't always about likability, right? But like, I feel like you gotta find some element of that character that you find appealable or within their story arc to like kind of latch onto, even if they're unlikable. Like, the picture of Dorian Gray, like, not a likable person at all. Like, the point is that he's unlikable, or, well, not so much unlikable, just more of that, like, he's morally corrupt, and like you have to like watch him go through that. But the thing that you can like latch onto is just like that kind of dark side of yourself that's like, oh, what if I did all of those things that I really wanted to do but knew was wrong and never went through with it? Like, there's something there for me to latch onto. But like with Wuthering Heights, none of the characters I'm like, oh, this is cathartic to like see someone play out this particular trait or something. Like, there's nothing like that for me. The writing that Emily Bronte brings to the table is fantastic. So like, I gotta recognize that. And also the atmosphericness of it, I love that. I love like the imagery that you get from the novel. And you know, like, the plot, it is interesting enough to be like, oh, I do want to keep reading and try to figure out what happens, because like, I mean, it's a Victorian soap opera. Like, it doesn't take place in the Victorian age, I should probably specify, but it was written in the very, very early part of the Victorian age, I'm pretty sure, because I think it was like 1845. I should probably look these things up. Okay, upon review, it was published in 1847, and we can assume it was written kind of sort of around that time. So it is Victorian, early Victorian. But I think the novel was actually set in like the early 1800s, and I only say that because like when I was getting to like the past like couple chapters when Lockwood returns, it said like 1801, and then like talked about like the spring of this year I went back, and I was like, wait, really? Regency? I thought this was Victorian. So like, I don't know, but like the actual novel came out during the Victorian times, and I don't actually remember what my original point was to that, but whatever, there's the contact. Oh, anyways, that's all I have. I don't want to do an outro. Just leave, just click off. Thanks, bye. Didn't look beautiful. She wouldn't